more often than not.
Recording in progress.
More often than not, you guys can find me on Twitter at Prof. Matt DiCarlo, or you can also visit my website at opensocialwork.org. This presentation is titled Statistically Free of Race and Gender Bias, Gaslighting as Methodology in Social Work Licensing Exams. So just a quick agenda. We're going to be starting off with Gerald. Gerald is a license-seeking social worker. I'll give you his intro in a little bit. The bulk of the presentation is going to be on a very, very light level of psychometrics, as well as what are some of the issues inside the exam, and how does that lead to some of the stuff that we see as far as the disparities in exam pass rates. Once we sort of go over some of that stuff, we'll do a little bit on what policy action is happening right now, because there is a lot and it is moving very fast. And finally, we'll have a question and answer session. I do intend to stay and answer any questions that you all have. If you have burning questions, oh, right, I have housekeeping stuff in a different slide. Hey, I'm Matt. I already introduced myself. These are my books. They're free. They're open textbooks. So I run a project called Open Social Work. We focus on knowledge as a human right and access to knowledge as something that helps us secure human rights, as well as argue for new ones. So we often use things like open textbooks, open access journal articles, which I know I've corresponded with at least one of you about, also open science and open data. So this project really came out of the open data part of that, and really looking at data equity and how opening up access to ASWB data can really reveal some of the things that are going on underneath. All right. I have used, like, my dad saw this presentation. He had no idea what gaslighting meant. So if you guys were okay doing this, I would very much love it if you guys could define gaslighting in your own words inside of the chat. Not everybody has to do this. If you want to go the advanced route, you might also think about, how do you know if you were being gaslit? Yeah. Awesome. Nice to see you, KMM admin. Thank you for clarifying. I definitely got your username from Donna. Yeah, you're with my dad. Love that, Patricia. Yes. Cool. All right. So Kate talked about it as fooling someone by making them think they are wrong and crazy. Doing something to switch somebody's attention, convincing somebody that they're wrong, making somebody think they're wrong, blame, or crazy. Yeah, basically bullshitting, lying, but in a more sort of power-oriented, abusive kind of way. Gaslighting is often used as a term for people who are in abusive relationships, but it means more broadly and culturally that, yeah, somebody's pulling the wool over your eyes, and yeah, you get the idea. So speaking of chat, I have difficulty sitting still in any class or in anything that I do. So please chatter in the chat. That's why it's there. I will try and pay attention to it somewhat while I'm doing this stuff, but I am going to try and focus on most of that stuff at the end. Right. Yeah. If there are things that are like really breaking, like stuff that's like, hey, I can't hear you anymore, this broke, or like, or something like, I need something very quickly, Donna will cut in and sort of do that. And yeah, all right, cool. So with that, I get to shut up for the small part of this presentation where that's scheduled. And I get to do a really awesome thing. Gerald is actually how I got into this work. And it was the screenshot that he posted on Twitter of his experience going through the exam, which is really just around things like gender diversity and gender identity. And it sort of blossomed into understanding some of the dynamics behind the exam, and you sort of go from there. So Gerald is a clinical case manager with Inova Health System. He's worked there for 5 years, but he's been doing the clinical mental health thing since 2014. He graduated with his MSW in 2018 from the University of North Dakota, and he is currently attending Columbia University Nursing School. With that, thanks, Gerald. I'm going to stop sharing.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm so elated to be here today. Thank you, Matt, for the wonderful introduction. And I think this is a very important dialogue for the profession to have. I honestly, when I ended up taking the clinical exam during my initial attempt, I was quite shocked at my result. I missed by 3 points, and subsequent attempts have been between 1 to 5 and 7. And it was quite demoralizing as an experience. So naturally, I'm an advocate. I'm an advocate for the patients that I am privileged to serve. And I felt a need to be an advocate for myself and the future vitality of the profession, especially given the ongoing stress and trauma that we are all collectively experiencing with this multi-year pandemic. I just felt a need to speak up, and I'm so grateful we are having these conversations. I can just share personally. I feel my university prepared me well for social work. I finished with a advanced journalist background, and I have wide experience, placements in private practice and in medical settings, and which made me feel quite surprised given my results. And I noticed one aspect with the examinations. I noticed the questions. They do tend to differ depending on your attempt. So one question can truly be more clinically focused, and another can be more macro focused and encompassing research. I was quite surprised, especially given a clinical focus. And I understand in social work, we're in various types of practice settings, but it has caught me off guard throughout all of my attempts. I have spent over $500 when it comes to test prep. I've sought private tutoring. You name it, I tried it. This profession, it is still near and dear to me, even as I attempt to bridge nursing. Social work is truly near and dear to my heart, because I'm very social justice oriented, and I truly believe social work can change communities. So it is my hope, with continued dialogue and advocacy, we all can create change, because it is direly needed. So thank you so much, Matt. And if anyone has questions afterwards, I am definitely open.
Cool. Thank you so much, Gerald. I'm going to go ahead and reshare here. All right. So Gerald's is one story among many, and it's a worthwhile question to sort of think about: how often does this stuff happen? How often are people who are from different racial and ethnic backgrounds pass or fail the licensing exam? And for a long time, we had no real data on this. We had to sort of work around that. So this is an initiative out of New York City that tried to do it based on CUNY alumni. They ended up finding some of the same racial disparities that you see, as well as the race by age intersection that was also quite significant in the ASWB report. This is a study that was in part, this was funded by ASWB. They found Joey Kim is from Rutgers University. He got about $1 million from ASWB, I believe. I don't really remember the exact figure, but they did some really good studies on the social work workforce. This is one of them. They ended up finding that for bachelor's level social workers, who are people who are taking the LBSW exam, that none of the things like variations in state regulations, what like field they were in, whether they were in child welfare versus like children's mental health or whatever it is, and their like general vulnerabilities inside of society, none of that explained away the black-white testing disparity. And that is in an article published by ASWB. They did find that for the MSW exams, it was explained away. So definitely something to think about. But yeah, our central question here, and what I hope to be able to deliver to you guys, is, are the flaws that self-advocates like Gerald, self-advocates like some of my other co-organizers, as well as critiques from the literature and practitioners, as well as the NABSW, are all these people pointing out things that are really wrong in the exam? Or like, is ASWB making methods or procedural errors that lead to these wildly different results? And so it's like a weird thing to do, to like rate your exam developer, but that's kind of the goal here. Yeah, it seems like a good thing. Like, don't lie to the people who are taking your test. Follow best practices and methodology. You'd think that we should do that. Publish data that other people can read and see. Publish a procedure that makes sense. I want to shout out Kathy. Thanks for the nods. Appreciate you. Fix broken things. Nothing's perfect. The perfect amount of measurement error is not zero, because it's impossible to get there, and getting there will break everything. There's differences between groups that are going to be there when you measure things. However, there's also broken things in the exam, and ASWB does do some fixing, but we're going to talk about some of the challenges in how they approach it. Charge reasonable prices. Seems like a good thing. And since ASWB often speaks with NASW and CSWE on behalf of the profession, steward the profession responsibly. Those seem like good things. I don't know, man. I like the chat thing. So like, if you guys rebel, that's cool too. But what do you guys think? Are they like 6 out of 6 good? 6 out of 6 is very good. 0 out of 6 very bad. Throw it in the chat. Some kind of fraction between 0 and 1. As all fraction. Well, I guess all fraction. All right. Cool. Starting with don't lie. So the title to this presentation, Statistically Free of Race and Gender Bias, comes from the ASWB's Candidate Handbook. All the way back in 2021, all the way back to 2014. That's the last one I can find online, but I'm pretty sure it was there before this. They told everybody their exams were free of race and gender bias. That's a lie. Do you already know it's a lie? Because it's not there anymore. Did you? Yeah, there was no announcement about that either. Instead, they sort of dirty deleted the fact that they used to say that there was free of race and gender bias. And instead, there's this thing where it says that there are differences, or sorry, there may be differences, even though we know that there are because we see the report, but they're due to factors external to the exams. Nothing's wrong with the exams, everybody. So just as they delete some of those things that are not true from their candidate handbook, they add in things that are also not true. Because as we found when they released that report, there were some pretty wide disparities. If you guys aren't familiar with this report, I encourage you guys to take a look at the whole thing. But be wary of their scholarly communications, because there was some misinformation in those infographics. Because if you look at the report and you read the methods section, I'm a research methods instructor. I realize that's not everybody's thing, but it is my thing. And so I read the methods section where it says first time pass rates will be used throughout the report because those make the most methodologically clean data. You know, if somebody takes the exam 10 times, like, how do you know that the 10th one is really the thing that matters, not like the numbers 1 through 9? You would do the first one so you can sort of get the cleanest comparison across groups. Yet every single figure in their report uses eventual pass rates. Every infographic that they shared on social media uses eventual pass rates. And I just want to like point out that like the differences between these two statistics is not that much. Is like 72 versus 80 really that much worse? I don't think it is. So like, why lie? Why do that when you know that people could just look in the appendix and get the real data? And so when you go into the appendices, and I pulled them out here into a little bit more visually appealing format, yeah, it's pretty easy to see just how bad things are. So that race by age, I mean, I teach a lot of adult learners, man. I love teaching them. I love teaching community college graduates. I love teaching non-traditional students. My favorite thing about them is that their problems are real. They don't have like traditional college student problems. They have families, they have job experience. It's amazing. And it's just nuts to me that like every like Black student over 50 that I taught, only 20% of them can pass the LCSW exam. Only 20% of them can pass the LBSW exam. Really? Really? Less than 40% of Black people can cover the LBSW exam? That's nuts. It doesn't make any sense. This is just the data from ASWB. There's no new data. But you can see the disparities are across every single exam. And while the patterns do shift a little bit, you see here, let me go back to here. You see differences by race, you see differences by language, and you see differences by age. So a lot of people read the report, and you might email ASWB and you're like, hey, what's up? I read this report. You said there was no bias, and you might get a response from somebody like this. So this is the key lie here. This is really the thing that inspired this presentation. So if, I mean, I know Zoom meetings, man. So if there's like other things going on, this is the thing. They lie and say that bias is evaluated at the individual item level. So on a 100-question exam, you see bias number 1, bias number 2, bias number 3, bias number 4. You get the idea. And you do that. But they say that it's not the final pass rate data that's used to identify bias in exams. They also have some boilerplate about how they meet and exceed standards, and these are the standards that they use. Those are also in the chat at this point. So if you guys are interested in those, we're going to take a look at them today, but they're there for your reference. They're available as open access. So their key lie is that bias is assessed for at the individual test question level, that these differences in exam scores are not a sign of predictive bias. That is an easily refutable lie. Predictive bias is defined in the standards that they cite, that it is the differences in patterns of association between test scores, not individual items, based on group membership. It's just weird that they would lie about that. Anybody could look that stuff up. We're also going to talk about some jargon terms. How many people here didn't like the research methods class? It's okay. I know I'm a research methods instructor. You can say yes. It's fine. Thanks, Kathy. Appreciate you. Denise, yes. All right, cool. They are weaponizing your hatred of research against you. There's only 2 terms. There's no test. I promise you are more than capable of understanding all of this. I get a lot of this crap, even from my co-organizers who are like, oh, that's you do the research stuff. Like, no, this is not hard to understand, y'all. So differential item functioning is what's, we'll get into some of that stuff, but the differential item functioning is the bias in individual test scores. Differential test functioning is differences in test scores. And what they basically say is, they say this often in public as well. Anytime you look up what ASWB says about their differential item functioning or bias and how they do some of this stuff, diff comes up. Diff is important. Diff is a great thing to do. They say that, you know, they do this all the time. Any pre-tested items are subject to this analysis. And every year, about 5% of all items show some of this bias. And then they go back and then they evaluate them, which is true. They do that. They also bring up something that I'm not going to talk about as much here. It's just a good idea. They also have a diverse group of subject matter experts who write their questions for them. So, I don't know, man. I gotta see your scores. Hey, hated research of any kind. Feel that. Got you. Oh, nobody graded them. All right. Well, they failed this. Sorry. Cool. Going a little bit more into methodological best practices. So why does bias manifest in exams? The whole idea is that Stuff that's unrelated to social work ability is getting tested here. And that's why you see those differences between identifiable subgroups. There's something else going on that leads these scores to be different. One important source of that stuff is, where are we? There. Whether the concepts have equivalent meaning across different cultures. Do the concepts cross international barriers? Might that be one of the reasons why people who don't speak English as a first language do poorly or do poorer on the exam? When those concepts don't generalize across borders or cultures, that can really lead to invalid test score interpretations, and we should have that careful attention towards bias. And you can see this inside of some of the stuff that Gerald was talking about, and also some of the stuff that you see inside of the, when you talk to test takers, they're often told to think like a white person, or think like the test writer, which is another way of saying think like a white person. Don't answer how you would actually do it in practice. Call child welfare, call the cops, call your supervisor, even if that's not necessarily what you would do in that situation, or if you would really need to talk to somebody else like before you did that. Ignoring racial microaggressions. So if the example inside of the question has some stereotypes inside of it, or like it just randomly identifies people's race without having to do anything with the question, which is some of the stuff that we see inside of their practice exams, you have to ignore that stuff. If you don't use Freud's stages of psychosexual development or Erikson's theory of like the lifespan, you may not be as familiar with those theories. And since ASWB replicates all of the problems in academia with sort of white dominated theories, it's like they literally ask us what textbooks we use. It's not like it's, you know, entirely their fault, but yeah, ultimately it's just hard to do that without context and detail. It's trying to instrumentalize something that for a lot of people is tacit. I mean, the amount of people in this room who have been practicing for decades, it'd be really hard to do the ABCD version of that stuff. So again, the core of this is differential item functioning. And that is when your membership in a certain subgroup, racial subgroup, age subgroup, language speaking subgroup, is leading to changes in how well you respond to question number 17 or question number 18. Differential test functioning is the same idea, but for the whole test. And again, I'm citing the standards that ASWB uses. I remember reading these for the first time and being like, wait, that's a thing? Differential test functioning is a thing? Because like, they don't mention it. ASWB doesn't mention that, which is weird. Again, diff, is this question bias? Is this test bias? ASWB only analyzes for diff. And like, it's not that they just like don't do, they just don't acknowledge that it exists as like a thing that you might want to do, which is weird because when you dive into some of the psychometrics literature, which has existed for probably 4 decades at this point, the oldest site I could find for the exact problem I'm looking at is 1984. Differential test functioning, how well somebody performs on the exam based on group membership, is the primary concern for organizations like social work boards and also social work employers who are making employment decisions based on test results, because those selection decisions are based on total test scores, not individual items. So this whole thing about diff is, while important, not really the thing that we're talking about when we're talking about differences in exam scores. Y'all, this makes no sense. ASWB proudly stated in an open letter to social work deans and directors that they don't collect this data. This data that, according to the standards that they cite, they're required to collect. They just don't. In fact, they've said on paper that they don't collect exam outcomes based on demographics. They only analyze at the item level. So what we know is that this exam has been kind of bad for a while. And when you think about advocates who are saying like, give us the data, we are asking that they perform a differential test functioning analysis, which they should be doing anyway. And that leads to the report, at least the partial report that you all saw. Man, the organization that accredits my university and gets to decide whether we actually give real degrees or not thinks that ASWB is covering up more data. According to their public statements addressing the licensing exam pass rates, the data that we all saw is incomplete and contains flaws. and they demanded that a full analysis of the data be made available beyond the descriptive analysis that has been shared. So I hope I've at least made a somewhat convincing case that methodological best practices, especially the importance of differential test functioning, is a major flaw here. Publishing auditable data and procedures. So ASWB talks a pretty good game. I mean, if you guys read their public statements, you know, they sort of call out advocates for drawing conclusions based on limited information and misinformation and disinformation. But considering that all of their scholarly communication is misinformation, it's hard to do otherwise. I really would like to. Yeah, so we're going beyond the descriptive information, you know, but they're also, you could release the multivariate analysis. Like that would be helpful. Yeah, this stuff needs to be in the light, not the shadows. I wonder if the standards have anything that talks about documentation. They do. So the testing documents need to be available in sufficient detail to permit reviewers, which is ASWB. ASWB both writes the exam and purchases the exam. That's a problem. And also researchers like me and other more competent researchers who would be able to do things like look inside of the test manual and technical report, judge the data on which decisions and conclusions were based. We don't use factor analyses, we use item response theory approaches, but basically get the sample size and be able to recreate some of those analyses with de-identified data. But more than that, we should be able to get some of those test score interpretations to people who are going to take the test, to people like Gerald, who are trying to figure out, is this something that I even want to do anymore? We should be providing this stuff to MSW students and BSW students so they can make an informed choice when they are choosing mental health professions. So the last time they published anything about what they do was 2010. These are ASWB's methods as written by Stephen Marson. Stephen Marson is a second party to ASWB. He's done some paid work for them. I think he's done some volunteer work as well. And so he published a report with some other colleagues on ASWB's methodology in research on social work practice. And so the nut graph of it is basically they do the differential item functioning. They group people based on, there's technically 4 categories, but it's basically whether you're an awesome social worker or you are a terrible social worker. A good question most of the time should be able to distinguish between a great social worker and a bad social worker. And that's the whole idea. As long as it's able to do that to a significantly or to a good degree, the question goes in. If it's sorting like bad is good and good is bad, you throw it out or try and rework it. And according to Stephen Marson, it's less than 1% of items. Well, how do we do comparative ability? There's no like, we don't do like GPA, there's no like GRE score. So like, how do you gauge what's a good social worker or a bad social worker? The test does that, right? You would need to use the test score. Yeah. Literally, their analysis for item level functioning uses the test score as an input, a measure of ability that we know is biased to heck and has significant differences between race, age, and ethnic groups. So although ASWB sort of pretends that item level functioning and test functioning are separate, they're actually very much intertwined. And their item level analysis, such as it is, unless it has been updated, requires an unbiased test score in order to function, which they don't have. But it also gets worse. And I'm not going to get into what point biserial correlations are at this point. Basically, the idea is that they do a correlation analysis, and based on the correlation statistic, they either accept or reject the question. And if you look at the standards, it says specifically not to do that. It says specifically that correlation coefficients provide inadequate evidence for differential prediction hypotheses if groups or treatments are found to have unequal means and variance on the test. Again, they pretend that item level functioning and test functioning are separate. They're really not. And the standards that they cite specifically call out high stakes testing and avoiding the use of correlation coefficients in situations where groups or treatments result in unequal means. Oh, that's a double quote. Sorry about that. ASWB's exams, I hope I at least argued somewhat competently, are broken. They very likely have high differential test functioning. Again, Black social workers over 50 are over 3.5 times less likely to pass their exams than white social workers of any age. How could their expected test score, because DTF is a like multivariate measure, how could that be so different than their actual real world score? So it has like really, really different exam scores, but low diff, where like all of the items show low diff. I mean, over the past decade, their differential item functioning has increased 500%. That's not good. More and more items are showing diff, but like small diffs, depending on what their tolerances are, can really add up to high variances in test scores. And so what we have here is that there's a lot of small biases that are embedded in most of these questions that end up adding up towards exam level bias. Diff can go in a lot of different directions. And, you know, because there's no auditable data or procedure, we can't really understand more than that. That's about as far as we can go to understand what's going on. Because ASWB won't share things like how many times people have to take the exam again to pass. Other demographics or intersections, the slopes or intercepts of their regression, sample sizes, rules for cut scores, any of that stuff. Let's say you're like Gerald here and you took the exam, I don't know, like 2 years ago and didn't do well. Maybe you like missed it by a question. ASWB actually continues monitoring for differential item functioning. So let's say that exam that you took in 2018, in 2020, they ended up finding that, oh man, it's having a drop in performance. That item's going to have some differential item functioning. We got to get rid of that. That's 5% of all of the questions. They don't tell anybody. So if you took a test in 2018 and in 2020, they have no publicly stated policy, and I've never heard of them contacting somebody and saying, hey, you know that question you missed the exam by like one? It's biased. You have a license. We don't even know how many like questions that they've removed. So again, no data. All right. So ASWB could pull it together, man. Like maybe we should work with them. I don't know. If you're assuming that your exam is already valid when it's shown to have really big differences in exam scores, that's a big red flag. That, yeah, beginning with an in-depth review of item generation. So yeah, there's that. And then like, here's some free resources that, you know, we like make millions of dollars on publishing them, but like, here's some free ones. You know, you can have these conversations. I volunteered for them. For some reason, they don't invite me. That one didn't fly. So they put out a second one, exploring and researching and revisiting the exam structure, maybe doing some simulations or something like that, and engagement and like, cool. Again, man, I'm sorry that the theme for this presentation is like, this is what ASWB says, and here's what the standards say. Here's what you actually have to do. These potential sources have to be investigated independently. You have to do a diff analysis and a differential test functioning analysis because, and again, the standards talking back to exactly the thing that we are dealing with, a predictor test like the ASWB exam may show no significant levels of diff, yet show group differences in regression lines predicting how good of a social worker somebody is. So even though there may not be significant levels of diff, you can have really significant levels of DTF. ASWB is not measuring for that. And that is, I think, why you see some of the things that you see. They're supposed to, now that they've discovered that this is a problem, do some small sample methodology, some cognitive labs, some focus groups, small scale tryouts. That is the stuff that they're supposed to do from the standards. Some of the other stuff from the psychometrics literature. Let's say you have a 100 question exam, 30 of the questions have differential item functioning. You can do their overall score based on just the ones that don't have it. That's called purification. Other things you might do are intersectional analyses for differential item functioning. So what differential item functioning does is compare like white and black and different races, but it doesn't intersect that with other identities. And we know that's not really how oppression works, and that's not really how racism works. So using more intersectional analyses or just other measures from the psychometrics literature would be helpful in elucidating what's wrong and how to get there from here, but ASWB is not committing to doing any of that. Instead, they're going to keep saying the same thing that they've been saying forever: highest standards of validity and reliability. Keep in mind, this is the only report that they have ever produced that has anything to do with validity or reliability evidence. There's never been any auditable or verifiable data. There's not even any public reports that have like summaries. Pamela, do you mind muting yourself? Pamela, do you mind muting yourself? Thank you. So why are ESWB's exams so expensive? Well, who's at the bargaining table? On one side, ASWB. On the other side is WB. Because ASWB is just like the regulatory organization that's accountable to the members of that association, the regulatory bodies in 64 states. ASWB, according to Dwight Hymans, is not a social work organization. So what we end up having is self-dealing. The exam developer, ASWB, buys the exam developer, the exam buyer, the state boards, buy the exam from ASWB, which they technically constitute, and social workers, students, no one else is represented inside of that negotiation. And then what you end up happening is a captive market of social workers for examination and test prep. ASWB, as a nonprofit, carries an 18% profit margin. Why? Why? It makes no sense. Why have their assets on hand gone up 400% in the last decade? I am using statistics from their Form 990s. All of those are available in the links to this presentation. But yeah, big shout out to ProPublica. And you compare that 18% profit margin with like other for-profit industries, like it's really weird to have a like social work regulator that has a higher profit margin than the financial services sector or the energy sector. Yeah. ASWB is a nonprofit with a for-profit business model. They make about $13.7 million in exam revenue. That was back in 2020, so that's the most up-to-date statistics I have. But they don't actually do most of the like testing themselves. They do the psychometrics at Pearson. They outsource for that. And they also outsource the test administration to Pearson. And volunteers write and review the questions. It's a pretty good business model. Indeed. What would you do with that business model? I would invest it in the market. ASWB certainly does. According to their Form 990, they hold $26.1 million in publicly traded securities. Again, why? Why is all of this money stuck in ASWB? They have no plan to spend it on the profession. It's just there. Oh, that's true. They actually do spend it. They spend it on lobbyists. So I talked with Jayashree Nibaganda, who is the dean at Rhode Island College. So she sort of filled me in on some of the stuff that Rhode Island social workers are working on. We'll touch on that a little bit later. So ASWB hired the most expensive lobbyist in the state to fight them on something like eliminating the LMSW examination, creating a Spanish language examination, and exploring alternatives to exams. All right, last one. I know I've talked for a long time, but I'm sorry I had a lot to say. Yeah, man, these standards, I mean, they're not like laws, but like when people get hauled into court, they're the things that are cited. And that compliance or non-compliance can lead to, can be seen as relevant evidence of legal liability in judicial and regulatory proceedings. And that careful consideration by all participants in the testing process is necessary. And it's that last one that really stuck with me. It's that last idea from psychometricians as to what's needed for a good exam to happen. And it means the community that the communities and stakeholders that are affected by it take careful consideration for it. And we haven't done that. This stuff is basic, man. I should not be the person checking this stuff. It should not be the first time somebody notices. We have a duty to do it. We have a duty to rise above our self-interest and our narrow professional self-interest, to promote ethical practices and organizations, and also to prevent and expose and correct unethical behavior by other social workers, which this is. But that's not necessarily the only thing that motivates them. I don't know if you guys heard, but this year, the New York City Board of Education finally settled a lawsuit from 1996. So you can think about like how long testing has been going on in the teaching profession and the social work profession. So how long do these cases take to actually play out, these racial discrimination cases? So the state mandated exam, it's called the LAST exam. It's a literacy test, white test takers, 93%. So you can see some of the same or similar disparities here. Well, the Board of Education has finally agreed to stop appealing judgments and has awarded clients about $660 million because they required exams that were shown to be racially biased, that were unrelated to their job tasks. Apologies in advance for the Daily Caller link, but they do a good job of breaking down why. Of course, the Daily Caller link quotes 1.8 billion. I can't tell you what it's been because it hasn't happened yet. But this is from July. So a New York court found that that violated Title VII of the Civil Rights Act back in 2012. Again, this is 10 years after that original decision, because its content, the content of that exam didn't have a direct correlation with the teacher's work or teacher's performance in the classroom. I encourage you guys to think about, like, how many times does that happen in social work? How many times, like, I had to pass the LG exam, or sorry, the LMSW exam here in DC because my job paid me extra to do it. It wasn't really related to my job, but like, and I could have continued as a licensed person, but like, that might be something that might open them up to liability at this point. We haven't really seen where federal courts will go after this, but we are seeing the payouts. $1.1 million for somebody who failed 10 times and lost their job. Failing 5 times and losing your job, $1.2 million. So it's a Daily Caller article, so they're always going to have a quote like this: can't claim a test is racist, discriminatory, just because a higher percentage of a certain class of people or race or ethnicity do worse. That's not sufficient. Totally true. Absolutely true. So remember this. They don't do differential test functioning. Would you guys trust like a Beck's depression inventory if they didn't do that? Because this is the same standards. Would you trust the SATs if they didn't say like, oh, do the whole SATs, like, are they okay? Or is it just like the individual question? Like, it's nuts. And their differential item functioning, even if it were sufficient, is broken because they use the overall exam scores to validate individual items. And they don't have an intersectional focus and don't share their data or methods for doing so. And they've never had any data that shows that their exam is reliable or valid or protects the public. It's designed to do that, but we don't actually know that it does. Last on the checklist, where do we go from here? So I speak only for myself here. I don't speak for my co-organizers, although we've definitely talked about this a lot. I think that what seems to be the emerging consensus among people who are working on this at the state level is that the first thing that needs to happen is for those states that do have ASWB exam in their state codes, that needs to go. That ditching LBSW and LMSW exams are the next step. Demanding open data and procedures is also important, and getting towards alternatives to the LCSW exam by 2024 when the new round of ASWB exams comes out. So number one, stop enforcing a monopoly. Stop enforcing a legal monopoly. It's a terrible idea. So Virginia just passed this. This is stuff from their draft language. They didn't have the meeting minutes yet posted, but they just passed something that allows them to use a state examination. Other things that you guys might want to advocate for include the exact terms from the compact, qualifying national exam. So just opening up state codes to saying qualifying national exam will not only put you in line with the compact, but will also open you up to other alternatives to the exam should they emerge. Speaking of which, in Rhode Island, as I mentioned, this is again the draft language here. They did end up passing this. They are required to have a Spanish language exam, which you can tell from the results of this study is a great idea. You should absolutely have a Spanish language exam. And if ASWB does not produce it, they're gonna have to make one. That's now a new exam that competes with the ASWB exam. We are going to hear very briefly from the head of NASW Illinois on their experience with eliminating LBSW and LMSW exams.
I'm going to actually really focus in on some of the efforts we did here in Illinois. So even before the data was released, our chapter took a look at this, took on this issue.
Oh, my bad. Sorry. Evidently, I can't switch away from this.
Barriers to licensure via the ASWB test. And on August 6, 2021, Governor J.B. Pritzker, that's our governor here in Illinois, signed Senate Bill 1632 into law, which removed testing requirements for licensed social workers. In Illinois, there's LSWs, that's the non-clinical level of licensure that Cassandra had noted earlier in her introductory remarks, which became effective January 1 of this year. This achievement was sponsored by State Senator Karina Villa, who's a school social worker, and Representative Lindsay LaPointe, who's an MSW graduate, and has already paved the way for a massive increase in licensed social workers here in Illinois. And we are a state that is in desperate need of mental health professionals, especially BIPOC social workers. So in the first 6 months of this new law, just under 3,000 LSWs became licensed in Illinois. That's an increase from 421 for the same period in 2021.
I just want to underscore that. So when they eliminated the exams, they went from having 400 LBSW level licensees to 3,000. Obviously, there's some amount of backlog here, but we're going to go into some of the concerns about public protection as well as other stuff as well.
To say removing this barrier to access has been a success is an understatement. And I just want to point out too that when we were developing the legislation, simultaneous discussions with our Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, the data showed that this population poses little risk to the public, and that rigorous pre- and post-graduation supervision requirements, coupled with existing Illinois requirements, in other words, all LSWs performing clinical social worker must be under the order and control and full professional responsibility of a licensed clinical social worker, created an environment where additional testing became simply unnecessary. So as the numbers bear out, the passage of our LSW law continues to allow BSWs to continue a path of licensure and employment in the profession. It's removed the burden to access that disproportionately affects BIPOC communities and social workers without resources to pursue an MSW. It removed another financial strain on recent MSW graduates and BSWs who have already completed their 3 years of postgraduate supervision by waiving the exam and exam prep courses associated with licensure. It's also created a logical path for MSWs to become LSWs while collecting the required supervisions for becoming a licensed clinical social worker in our state. It allows these individuals to be legally called social workers while giving IDFPR a better oversight of those currently unregulated professionals.
Yeah, again, I do want to point out that like by actually licensing these people, they are now brought under the protection of the licensing board, whereas before these were unlicensed practitioners doing unlicensed jobs in mental health. So, thanks, buddy. All right. Speaking of which, very recently, in the past week or two, CSWE, the national organization that accredits my school and all social work schools in the US and Canada, sent a letter to every single state board of social work saying, stop using the ASWB exam. We need to figure out what's wrong with it and correct for inequities, because what we're doing is not working. That we should consider for LBSWs and LMSWs granting licensure or pre-licensure status, as it is in Virginia, to graduates of accredited social work programs, and that citing the work in Illinois, that LMSW examination is not necessary. Also to decouple the interstate compact from the ASWB licensure exam. That's tough. It's really we'll see from the people who have authored the compact how that might be possible.
A question from Sierra in the chat related to lack of accountability from ASWB regarding the disparities in test results among Black, Brown, and Indigenous social workers. And how can we move towards a compact when this is a really serious issue related to our exams? So I'm going to ask a follow-up question that we've been considering and been hearing a lot from social workers. Given the release of this data, can the testing requirement be removed from the compact legislation? And what, I know that's a huge question and a huge hurdle, Keith and Nahali, what do you think about this?
So there's there's a direct answer to the can the compact be removed? It can be. We can remove the exam requirements from the compact if that's what the social work profession decides is definitely its future. Then that can be the compact can be structured, especially for bachelor's and master's category practice, to basically remove the exam requirement if that's what is decided. But that being said, there's also the political consideration, and so we can draft a compact that does not have an exam requirement, but if states look at the compact and say, well, we require exams still, we know that there were these issues with the ASWB exam, but we still require an exam, or we might consider alternative options, so it's a question of, can you? Sure. Will you ever get it enacted in states? That's the question that social work has to figure out. And CSG is happy to partner with social work in achieving its licensure goals, but we can't make decisions about the future of social work licensure and requirements because we're fundamentally not a stakeholder in the social work profession. Mm-hmm. And so these are ultimately questions that are up to you. And so that's kind of, I know that kind of talks around the issue, and I know that might not be satisfying to hear that, but ultimately these are questions that just we can't answer.
All right. So according to the authors of the compact, and I saw a question in chat about what is the compact. Remember all those awesome teletherapy rules that were in during COVID? We want those back. So the Interstate Licensure Compact is basically putting a licensure tier above LCSW that would allow you to practice in other states and deliver services across state lines. So the compact is related to all levels of the exam. Kate, thank you for the transition.
You feel strongly about it?
Give me that. So according to the compact currently, students and supervisees must take that $260 to take and retake and prep, and really only less than 40% of any Black student actually passes that exam to get their LBSW. Then they go to their MSW school, pay way too much money, and have to take a $260 exam and retake and pay for prep materials and do the same thing with their LCSW exam. Unless you're grandfathered in, of course, then you have to pay anything. So it's really important for states to act now. Unlike what Joel is saying in the chat, if states eliminate the PSW and MSW exams, it doesn't mean the compact is not going to happen. Basically, the first 7 people who sign on to the compact, first 7 states, are the people who get to determine what those rules are. Those people then form the commission. That is going to be a member from each social work board. And the goal is to try and get as many states, or a critical mass of states, to eliminate those exams and eliminate those barriers to licensure that really are duplicative of the assessments that happen inside of academia. So, developing alternatives.
The definition for qualifying national exam basically says ASWB exam or other competency assessment approved by the commission. So in case the ASWB exam changes or some alternative assessment is developed that states start using for licensure, the commission would have the flexibility to be able to approve additional exams.
Cool. So I hope that that clears up that issue. I know that that's a big concern because the compact is very important. We do need interstate practice that's actually useful. Of course, there's also the question of should we get rid of the exam? For many social workers, we did. In fact, there's an unknown number of social workers who were grandfathered in and were never examined at any level. And yet more that were never examined at the master's level, and yet more than that were never examined at the bachelor's level. So Minnesota's board has actually eliminated it, but it's just for people who don't speak English as a first language. This is one of the things that ASWB brought up to Rhode Island when they were considering eliminating the exam. Why don't you just do 2 years of additional supervised practice? I haven't heard of anything from Minnesota about these practitioners being more prone towards ethical complaints or anything like that. Similarly, the following provinces are not on fire from unregulated social work. That these boards and provinces, I don't think that we should copy their licensing and regulation all told, but none of these people use the clinical exam. And that Rhode Island's board, as I mentioned, is creating a Spanish language exam and is also exploring and developing alternatives to the LCSW exam. Finally, I did want to give a shout out to something that Florida tried a couple of years ago. They tried to give the LC like right after graduation because they were like, oh, we could do more test prep in school and like everybody's there, the knowledge is fresh. Why don't we just do that? And ASWB put the kibosh on that because that is not how the exam is designed. And when state boards sign on to the ASWB exam, you sign on to their software. You sign on the whole thing. It is either you use our exams or you use nothing. And so right now, state boards are in a position of either using the ASWB exams or using nothing. And so this is my conclusion. Sorry, thank you all for your very welcome patience. I mean, where you think the solution is may not be where I think it is, but like, I hope as a result of this presentation that you don't disagree that these methods errors are really bad and that they're so bad and they're so ignorant of just like basic psychometrics that we should not trust them to actually fix the exam because they don't know what's wrong. And that's because ASWB is not full of methodologists. There's no one that's a methodologist. It's just marketers. The methodology is outsourced to Pearson. The question development's outsourced to the profession. What the heck is the point of this? Why does this organization have $33 million in the bank? So I'm just really sick of reading stuff like this because like as a research methods instructor, I know that this is bullshit. Like I'm really sick of reading bullshit like this and because it's not methodology, it's just gaslighting pretending to be methodology. And that's the title for this presentation, that ASWB has really substituted this marketing gaslighting stuff for actual methodology. All right. So thanks, y'all. Thank you, Greater Washington Society for Clinical Social Work. Thank you, Lisa Kays. Lisa married me and my wife, by the way. We go way back. And thank you to all of my Stop ASWB co-organizers, most importantly, Gerald Joseph, wonderful. Charla, Shimon, Bethany, Cassie, Jen, Kim, and Tay. All right, y'all. I know that there have been a lot of things in the chat. I am a squirrel when it comes to attention.